Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Errol Yaibake. I am the Deputy Director and a Fellow here with the Project on Prosperity and Development, and it's my pleasure to serve as the moderator for this distinguished panel today. This event is part of our ongoing Chevron Forum, so thanks to Chevron for their support. And we're really excited to present a report that two of the authors are on the stage right now. So we wanted to dig in a little bit on energy, especially in a developing country context. We wanted to think about this in terms of not just providing access, which development people like me think a lot about. How do we get electricity and power to low income or poor people? And I think the conversation through the course of this year doing this research has really shifted to a broader sort of how do we unleash the powers of economic growth in the energy sector in the developing world. So the report acknowledges that developing countries are going to be the drivers of future demand for energy. But before I get into too much of what the report is going to say, or says and doesn't say, I want to turn it over to our Director of the Energy and National Security Program here at CSIS, Sarah Ladislaw. So, Sarah.
Great, thanks very much, Earl. Thanks everybody for being here, and for those of you who came for our CCS event earlier, thanks for being here twice. It was a real pleasure to work on this report. We started out about a year ago asking basically one fundamental question: what's new in the energy and development world? And we quickly realized, especially in working with our colleagues in the development program here at CSIS, that the energy world and the development world are two different things, and yet their interests are very much centered on the same places around the world. And this is because of what Errol was talking about, which is that energy demand is increasingly coming from developing economies, and the choices that those economies are making are in turn shaping the energy environment that we all live in, which is really important. And so we started out by having a series of roundtables with practitioners from both communities, both from the industry side of the equation, the government side of the equation, both here and governments from around the world, and then also with the academic community. Because one of the fundamental questions we started out with, as we do in a very think tanky kind of way, is what is the relationship between energy and economic growth? What do we know about it now, and what are our main questions that we have going forward about that, and how can that shape some of the priorities that we have, that governments in developing economies have, and how are they thinking about some of those things? And so we basically put together what we hope is a really good survey document of some of the other really good work that's been done out there by other organizations like the International Energy Agency, like some of the banks, development banks that are out there doing work on this topic, and really highlighted a few key things. And so I'm going to show you, because I know many people haven't gotten a chance to read the document yet, I'll show you a few of the graphics that, maybe I'll show you. A few of the graphics that exist within the core of the document, just to show you the kinds of things that we cover. I think the first and well-recognized point for everybody here in the audience is the fact that energy demand is predominantly coming from the developing world going forward. This is something we know, but I think it's really interesting to note that we are just 10 years away from the point in which developed and developing economies reached parity with one another in terms of energy consumption, and already the developing world represents about 58% of global energy consumption compared to 42% for the developed economies. Is that a really big deal? Sure, that's a good amount of growth over a short period of time. And if you take that forward over the next couple of decades, the amount of energy demand that's going to be added by these developing economies is roughly double what the US consumes today. So there's a huge amount of energy demand coming from these countries, and not all of it is China and India. In fact, it's sort of a third China, a third India, and then 1/3 from a range of other developing economies, including Brazil and Indonesia and Mexico, South Africa, forgetting a couple, Turkey. Thailand, Turkey. And so we basically wanted to look at some of the driving factors and what those countries are choosing. And so we can't go through all of it, but one of the things, we have our China ranking in top 10 energy statistics. over that very short period of time, China has basically become one of the top 10 in terms of oil consumption, oil importation, coal consumption, importation and demand, primary energy consumption, electricity generation. It is really hard, and this is all basically just to serve as a resource, but it's really hard to underemphasize the role that Chinese consumption and Chinese policy decision making plays in energy development today and going forward. And so why is this important? We won't go through all of the ways in which we talk about this, but one thing that we find is increasingly interesting, and I'm going to use this from Philip's perspective, is sort of the China model, right? Other developing economies don't necessarily just want to access low-cost energy resources in the quickest, most affordable way. They really want to be able to have a strategy to be able to develop new energy technologies, to be vendors of those energy technologies, to manufacture those technologies. You're finding this particularly in India, where there is a concern over the relationship between energy and labor, much more complex factors than I think many people in the energy world equate to the demand drivers in some of these countries. And I think China tells that story. I think people like the idea of the market leverage that they see and perceive China to have, and that growth experience that quite frankly has colored a huge amount of the energy trends in the energy policy dialogues that we've been having over the last several years. This is just another picture of that Chinese energy consumption, showing that not only have they continued to grow, but they've continued to reduce their energy intensity, and energy intensity being a predominant focus for some of these other developing economies as a way of being able to continue to develop and provide more energy resources and energy services, but do so in a way that doesn't push up against some of the energy security concerns that they may have about providing enough energy resources as well. This is just to show, this is a global new clean energy investment. This is a familiar slide from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Again, one of the things that we saw is that even though China is a giant producer of a lot of other energy resources as well, they continue to be, as this slide shows, a huge portion of new energy investment and new investment in clean energy. And that is something that I think has happened over the last 10 years or so that makes it really important to watch how China will continue to do this, not only at home, but some of the workshops that we had focused on things like the New Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese energy investment in other sectors other countries' energy sectors, and how they seek to create advantages for their energy technologies, both at home and abroad, and what a big role that they're playing in advancing those objectives. And we focus a little bit on the report on India in particular, and particularly looking at not only the question of electrification objectives. We cite in the report, there's a section that talks about energy poverty objectives, energy access objectives. I think there's a really good news story to be told in India about the question of access. Over and above just the question of access, the question of not just providing access to energy resources, but providing adequacy of coverage from those energy services, and how you sort of bridge that gap. We found that in a lot of the dialogues we were engaged in, there is an emerging conversation, not so much about just creating access, but looking ahead and saying, well, how do we utilize those off-grid connections, or we utilize some of these access programs to then connect to a centralized grid, or connect to broader segments of the economy. And we had one session where it was particularly pointed, where people were saying, well, there used to be sort of a dichotomy between centralized and decentralized power generation, and now through appropriate planning, you can have both of those things at the same time. It's not sort of an either-or option, and countries are really looking for sort of planning strategies to be able to navigate a transition from one to the other. In addition, a real focus on the fact that in order to advance to something like the grid of the future, you do have to be able to plan to not just create power generation capacity, but to invest in grid and enabling environments to be able to sort of bridge that transition from just creating power generation capacity to being able to sort of enable it as part of a system. And so there was a real sort of focus on the need for that conversation, which is in fact happening in some places. We cover a lot on the investment opportunity, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but if the International Energy Agency put out a recent energy report whose data we use to foster a conversation on the opportunity set that exists in developing economies in particular for energy investment. $1.7 trillion per year invested in the energy sector. I think one of their projections for the next several decades is $44 additional trillion going in that direction, and the majority of that taking place in developing economies. What's interesting is right now, much of that investment in developing economies, energy sector, is coming from state-owned enterprises and public spending. And one of the things, and I think maybe our friend from the IFC can talk a little bit about, is how to sort of catalyze or talk about the relationship between the investment that's taking place in the public sector, the policy drivers for that, and how to incorporate private sector investment into that space as well. As I said before, we focus a little bit on the access to electricity objective. We found that the vast majority of the conversations to be had on energy and development took place on this access agenda, which Philip is going to talk a little bit more about, so I won't belabor, but I would say I think it's a remarkable, we have an additional piece of work that will be coming out quite soon, but it is a remarkable showing of how many development institutions really catalyze and coalesce around these high-level objectives that come from, sustainable energy for all and from the SDGs and the mandate to eradicate energy poverty. There's some real great creative thinking out there about how to advance this agenda, but we found that the vast majority of the work and the policy dialogue that we were receiving from the development community was focused on these objectives and less so on some of those other mobilizing objectives. Mobilizing money objectives and investment objectives for some of those other energy needs that didn't have, that weren't as focused on the access agenda. And when we worked with some folks from other countries, there was seen as a bit of a divide there, as that maybe that money could be utilized better to incorporate both objectives rather than one versus the other. We also did a look at how climate change and sustainable energy objectives were influencing the kind of policies that were put in place in countries around the world. And what we found is, and this is work that was done by a great group, the REN 21 groups put out Renewables 2016 status report every year. Climate Scope from Bloomberg New Energy Finance did the same thing. And basically a review of the ways in which policies and objectives are advancing in many parts of the world to incorporate climate and sustainability objectives in policy decision making at a whole bunch of levels. This is just a summary. We don't have time to sort of go through all of it. But there are clearly places where policymakers are feeling more comfortable with putting forward policy objectives and regulations, and there's clear learning across sectors and in different countries about how to do this. And then there's areas where things are lagging. And so this is the section talks a little bit about how to discuss that and how to think about what some of those objectives could and should look like going forward. We do have a section on the local air pollution aspects of this. Again, we find that there's a sort of separate silos for these conversations. There's an air pollution conversation. This is a graph from WHO and in OECD that the IEA worked into their World Energy Outlook Special Report on energy, air, and pollution. They had done such good work on this. We sort of just summarized it as one of those areas in which there are discrete areas for policymaking and solutions in this regard, and we expect to see a lot more activity on this issue in the coming year in particular. One of the things we did in engaging academia, as I mentioned, was we worked with a group out at Berkeley and in the Oxford Energy Management Program group. They had a 2-day seminar here where they brought practitioners in the academic community to really ask questions about what we do and don't know as far as the relationship between energy and economic growth. For those of you who are in the room and interested in sort of the academic state of play on some of these issues, they're doing some really great work that we can't take credit for, but wanted to incorporate in the report in advancing the research objectives on how we understand where our investments are yielding economic growth when we're making investments in the energy sector. And so they've got, there was 18 papers, 18 peer-reviewed studies that we discussed over the course of 2 days. Certainly can't talk about them here, but they talk about things all the way from just the understanding of the standard model for electricity power models, and whether that's applied in the right places, this relationship between grid and centralized power stations, a whole bunch of issues that they're giving a new kind of look to, and I think it's well worth a resource for anybody who's interested in those topics. We basically put out all of these resources and tried to define for ourselves where are the areas that we wanted to spend more time in understanding not just where the development community is spending their time looking at the energy sector, but what is the feedback for that into how the energy landscape changes for energy companies, for policymakers going forward. And so I'm going to stop with that overview and turn over to Philip, who can talk a little bit about where we plan to go next.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. We're very excited to have both authors sitting here on the stage of this great report. Philip Benoit is an affiliate here with the Energy and National Security Program, but his day job is Managing Director at Global Infrastructure Advisory Services 2050. He has a long history at the IEA, which was referenced a lot, so in addition to the World Bank and the OECD and some other things. So I can't think of a better co-author for a report like this. So Philip, can you just talk to us a little bit about what these trends are in the developing world and what their strategic implications are moving forward?
Great, thanks a lot for that. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think, Sarah, you did an excellent job summarizing the report, so I won't really go into the report. What I'd like to do maybe is sort of just take a step back and discuss in some ways how we see this report as an opportunity as part of a strategic repositioning, a change in focus. What we find a lot of time when we talk about energy and development, and as Sarah mentioned, when you go talk to the development community about energy, the focus very much is on the issue of access. We have the Sustainable Energy for All issue. We have the SDG goal number 7, which talks about access. And these are extremely important initiatives to deal with an extremely important issue. In today's world, we have over 1.1 billion people without access to electricity. It's a key part of dealing with the whole poverty alleviation issue, the Human Development Index, and the like. But what we also find interesting is that when we try to sort of shift away from that access issue and look at some other issues, it becomes very difficult. And one of the biggest issues that we've seen is the following, is that basically, while historically OECD countries tended to consume most of the world's energy, as a result of a variety of factors, including population growth, GDP growth, in particular the explosion that we've seen in China and the like, we've seen this shift, which was reflected in one of Sarah's earlier graphs, in what's happening in terms of energy consumption. Energy consumption has shifted from OECD countries to developing countries. And it's done so in a big way. For example, China now consumes 3 times as much energy as it did 25 years ago. Its economy is about 8 times larger than it was 25 years ago, and those two issues are very much intertwined. And when we project into the future, what we see is that this trend is going to continue and is going to accelerate. In fact, for example, the IEA projects that over the next 25, 30 years, over 97% of the increase in global energy demand is going to take place in developing countries. That's really the result of 3 key factors: population growth, GDP growth in developing countries, and at the same time, while we see continued GDP growth in developed countries, what we see in these richer countries is increased energy efficiency, structural changes that are actually leading to reductions in absolute energy consumption. And that means when we think about the global energy landscape going forward, in fact, development and developing countries become critical. And so what we've tried to do through this report and through other efforts is to start to pivot the discussion to this bigger issue of energy and development, namely, how are emerging economies going to be using energy going forward? Now, I say that we want to do this without abandoning the extremely important access issue. Now, let me just come back to the access issue. What we are seeing on the access issue is actually a variety of important accomplishments. For example, the IEA just issued a World Energy Access Outlook. And if you look, for example, at India, India is making significant strides in reducing the number of people without access. And it's projected that in the 2020s, India is basically going to achieve universal access. A lot of the lack of access is going to be shifting to sub-Saharan Africa. But beyond the access issue is the issue of how do you actually transform that electricity into productive uses. And this is something that Sarah mentioned and is very much covered in the Berkeley analysis, and I'm sure it's something Morgan is going to discuss, one of the Morgans is going to discuss, because clearly the ultimate objective is not simply just giving people a light bulb and the like, it's really to help people raise themselves out of poverty. That becomes an integral part of what is really a broadened access issue. It's providing basic access and then enabling people to leverage off of that basic access for economic and social development, an effort that will continue to be at the forefront of many of the discussions in the energy and development context. But what we are also trying to say through this paper is that there is another extremely important issue when it comes to what's going on with energy, and that is the production and, more importantly, the consumption patterns of emerging economies. Because in some ways, when we think about the US current policy in terms of energy dominance and increasing exports, the fact of the matter is, because the expected increase in consumption is going to take place in emerging economies, when we look at it even from an American perspective in terms of where there may be opportunities to increase exports of energy, we have to focus very much in terms of what's happening in emerging economies. And so because of that, something that we've decided to do is to focus in on a select number of key drivers and actors that we believe will be important as we look forward. One of the key areas is in the area of transport. In fact, there are many projections that say that the number of cars in developed countries has basically stabilized and may actually diminish. And at the same time, you'll see projections from a variety of organizations and oil companies that point to a continued increase in the demand for gasoline. And what is fundamentally driving that continued increase in demand for gasoline is the fact that in developing countries, as they become less poor, as they become fundamentally richer, everybody projects an explosion in the demand for vehicles, for personal vehicles. That, the extent of that will have a major impact in terms of the demand for gasoline going forward. But at the same time, a critical issue will be how will these countries develop in terms of their transport system? Will they move to a system that is heavily dependent on personal vehicles, or, and probably both, to what extent will they push alternative systems of transport? For example, mass transport, trains, BRT systems, and the like. All of these type of dynamics will have an impact on the amount of gasoline that these countries will want to acquire, including potentially from the United States. And that pushes me into a second area that we want to look at as we move forward with this activity, and that is the issue of urbanization. What we know is that we're seeing a massive increase in cities' populations. In fact, the projection is that by 2050, 70% of the world's population will live in cities. But what I actually find more striking than the 70% figure is that 70% is 6.3 billion people. That's basically as if we take 9 out of every 10 people living in the world today and stick them in a city. That is what our cities are going to look like in 2050. What are the consumption patterns of the people living in those cities will have a major impact on the amount of energy and the type of energy that is required. In particular, for example, electricity is expected to be a major source of energy, and that drives me to a third point that we want to look at, which is the issue of natural gas. Natural gas is not only a major source for power, but it's also a major source for heat and the like. And we expect, everybody projects that there's going to be a significant increase in the demand for natural gas. That relates to LNG, so that is another issue that we want to look at. Having said all that, what is also clear is that the nature of technological innovation, the nature of changes in business patterns, in business models, will also have a major impact on how the global energy sector develops. When we look at developing countries, they are to a large extent less mature, less sophisticated than what we have in developed countries. And that means there are also opportunities for leapfrogging. There are also opportunities to develop innovation that is better adapted to the realities of their situation, to their various concerns. You mentioned the issue of pollution. We've seen major pollution concerns in Beijing, in New Delhi, and the like. How they innovate to try to deal with not only the issue of promoting development, but also dealing with those environmental concerns, those health concerns, will drive energy patterns going forward. We want to address that issue. Also because we believe that there's a major opportunity for the United States to be very catalytic and proactive in promoting that innovation. And then the last topic that I just wanted to touch upon is one that we tend to often overlook, and that is something that Sarah mentioned as well, the whole issue of state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises tend to dominate the energy sectors of many emerging economies. And unfortunately, state-owned enterprises don't respond to the type of market mechanisms and pricing incentives that we often ascribe to the private sector. And in fact, let's be honest, state-owned enterprises are also more present here than we often want to acknowledge. I came in on the Metro, which is a state-owned enterprise. We use them all the time. So one thing that we believe is important is to not only look at some of these drivers, not only look at some of these fuels, but also to analyze this special class of actors, state-owned enterprises, who are major players in the emerging energy landscape, in particular given their very dominant role in the steel sector, transport sector, oil and gas sector of emerging economies. So that's just to kind of give an overview, A, as to what we're trying to do through this paper and through the series of work that will follow upon it, and B, to give you a sense as to some of the areas of focus that we will be looking into.
Thanks, Philip. There was a lot there, and it sounds like there's a lot more work to be done. So it's an exciting time to be part of this discussion, because I think what we try to do here at CSIS more broadly is think about what the trends of the future are and more importantly should be. And I think a unifying theme of our project on prosperity and development is that it's not overseas development assistance that is the future, it's the role of the private sector that's going to catalyze not just access but growth, which leads me to this may be the first time that CSIS has ever had two Morgans on the same stage, so this is also an exciting day for that. But I'm going to start with Morgan Landy, who is the director of the IFC's Environment, Social, and Governance team. And for those that aren't aware, IFC is the largest global development institution focused exclusively on the private sector. And so Morgan, if you could just tell us a little bit more, comment on what you heard here and tell us a little bit more about how this is coming across your desk at IFC.
Great, thanks very much, Errol, and nice to see everybody. I was joking with the other Morgan that it's the first time I've ever been on a panel with two Morgans. It's a pretty rare name, and most of the Morgans you meet these days are 16-year-old girls. So to have two middle-aged men on a panel with the name Morgan is a bit shocking. So I'm very happy to be here with Morgan. So thanks for the invitation to be on the panel. I really enjoyed the report. I think it's timely, and there's a lot going on at the World Bank Group, IFC where I work, and the IBRD, World Bank, where the other Morgan works, that's relevant for this conversation. So we appreciate you doing the work to generate this conversation and inviting us to help participate in the conversation. I'll focus on the private sector. So as Errol mentioned, IFC, where I work, is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. So we were set up basically as our shareholders, which are effectively all the governments of the world, decided that just working through the public sector was not going to meet the development challenges in the emerging world. And so our job as IFC is to help channel private capital from ourselves and from banks, insurance companies, pension funds, private investors to productive private enterprise in the developing world. So we're basically a bank, a commercial bank, investment bank, private equity fund that's owned by governments, but our clients are private. And so we intermediate public capital and private capital. And one of the main objectives is to leverage in private capital and to try to see if we can help some of the private capital that's there in Brazil, in South Africa, in New York or Singapore, how to get that into the developing countries. And today we'll talk about energy, but it's really, as IFC, across the range, IFC is investing in all kinds of sectors in different countries and in different places. What we're seeing on the energy sector is a huge recognition of the incredible demand and need for investment, and the realization that public sources of investment are never going to meet that demand. So to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, to have any hope of meeting the development agenda of the global economy, is a clear need for capital, as well as expertise in management and operations, but capital is the big constraint today. And what we've seen over the years is, as Philippe was mentioning, the public sector is really historically driven most of the energy infrastructure investment when it comes to the developing world. And if that continues, the fear is that there'll never be enough public sector money to meet the objectives. There's not enough money to go around, and every country is having the same kind of squeeze on its resources, on their budgets, on the fiscal space. So there's an increasing need and desire and recognition of the importance to bring in the private sector as a key pillar, as a development partner, if you will, to meet the access goals, to meet the energy goals, the investment goals. And the question really is, how do you do that? How do you take a private capital perspective and apply it to a public good, if you will, of infrastructure investment, energy investment? And this is where it gets very, very interesting and tricky, but the good news is that there are solutions. The question is really, it's all local. Everything's a local decision. What is the policy environment in Brazil versus China versus India is a very local political discussion, and how that creates opportunities for investment, either public sector or private sector, is the space that IFC is very active in, together with our colleagues at the World Bank. What we're seeing in the energy side is that now there's a huge pace of change, which is creating huge opportunities, but also increasing risks. And the private sector, as we all know, loves opportunity and hates risk. So what we try to do as IFC is to figure out, where is the opportunity emerging for private capital to invest in the energy sector, whether it's in upstream or downstream or transport or renewable energy or transmission distribution grids, and try to see what we can do to catalyze more money flowing in to be productively used. And the mantra these days, and you may have heard it, is how do we take the current official development assistance, the ODA, which is in the order of magnitude of billions, and scale it up to be trillions? How do we make billions to trillions? And that's got to be a private sector story. It's not going to be more public sector money. We have to maximize the limited scarce resource of public sector money and figure out how to use that to more effectively attract private sector. And that's where we're doing a lot of thinking across the World Bank Group about how do we together, from the public sector side and the private sector side, how do we use our instruments, our tools, our policy advice, our relationships with regulators, with donor countries to maximize the impact of the money we have available? And how do we, on the IFC side in particular, use our tools to de-risk projects, to de-risk energy investments, to attract private capital that's maybe sitting now on the sidelines watching because there's too high a perception of risk, or perhaps not a high enough perception of potential return. So the question then becomes, how do we take this scarce resource of official development assistance and leverage it, not to finance a lot of power projects, for example, directly, but to really see, every time you look at a potential opportunity, could the private sector finance this? What could the World Bank do to help mitigate risk, to attract private capital, as opposed to financing it directly with scarce World Bank resource? And the same with IFC. What could we do to help attract other people to come invest and minimize the amount we have to invest to leverage third-party capital? This is really the thinking going on now across the World Bank Group. We have something called the cascade approach, which thinks about every time a World Bank Group a task manager is confronted with an opportunity, for example, task manager sitting in country A, and the government official says, can you please finance this airport or this toll road or this power plant? The first question should be, could the private sector do this? As opposed to, yes, let's use World Bank money for this. And the second point would be, if the answer is no, the private sector will not finance this, the question is why? Could we fix something in the regulations or in the planning side to make this an attractive investment to bring in private sector? And if not, the question is, well, maybe IFC should come in and think about using some official development aid / IFC, where MFI, a multilateral bank issue, but focused on the private sector, to use IFC funding to attract private capital with some de-risking, either from a World Bank instrument or an IFC co-financing. And then at the end, when there's really public sector need is clear, because the economics don't make sense. There's no viable reason to have a private capital invest in some sectors, or the tariff can never be high enough to recover the cost. Then you think about pure public sector financing, whether from the World Bank or others. This is the kind of thinking we're doing now, and it's pushing us in new directions, and helping us to think about how do we really mobilize other people and use our tools, either policy advice, regulations, some public sector financing, some private sector financing, to convince others to invest long-term, to meet this billions to trillions agenda. That's kind of what we're seeing. On the energy side, what we see is there is money, there's excess liquidity out there, and the question is, how do we get it to the places where it needs to go to meet the access agenda or to meet the energy development agenda? And I think there's lots of interesting thinking going on. I'll mention one program in particular we're working on is about one of the constraints to renewable energy development in some countries in Africa is the scale is relatively low, small scale, and for any particular investor to look at investing in a country like Zambia, it takes a lot of time, and the perception of risk is very high. So what we've done together with the World Bank and IFC and our political risk insurance arm, MIGA, is put together a package to help the government of Zambia tender for 50 megawatts of solar power through a competitive bid to get the lowest cost possible power. And then there was a pre-arranged financing package there with IFC money, World Bank guarantees to mitigate sovereign risk, and a package of money so the investors knew, whether they're local investors or South African investors or European investors or American investors, they knew that if they won the bid, there would be a risk management program available to them to close the transaction, to move forward. This is called Scaling Solar. We're applying it right now to the solar sector. It started in Zambia. We had our first transaction closed a couple of months ago. And we think that there's huge opportunities to think about, again, how do we get capital that's sitting on the sidelines to invest in these sectors? The last thing I'll say is on sustainability. So my current job, I worked many years in the energy sector. My current job is thinking about sustainability. And first of all, helping IFC and the World Bank Group to think about where policy should be set, and then operationalize those at the project level. What we're seeing is a huge realization and awareness about sustainability issues across the board. Whether it's in China, where they're worried about pollution control, or in Brazil, where they're worried about hydropower in the Amazon, or in Peru, where they're worried about social acceptance of the energy sector because of community issues. Every country has a reason to think about sustainability, and it's increasingly becoming a driving factor in the energy business. We think that's a good thing. We think the skill sets are being developed now to think about not just economics and not just environment, social, but put them together into a more holistic view of development. And we think it'll lead to better choices and better outcomes, but also will lead to pushing us and pushing everybody into new areas of thinking about things that are perhaps beyond their comfort zone, and internalizing the other person's perspective in the development world. So with that, I'll stop. I think it's a really interesting time. I think the developing countries are really the engine of growth. I think the private sector is going to be the main driver of that from a capital perspective. And for us at IFC, the question really is, how do we leverage our limited resources in partnering with the World Bank and others to really maximize and make sure that that investment is being done productively. Thanks, Errol.
Excellent. Thank you, Morgan. I want to turn to the other Morgan Bazilian, who is the lead energy specialist at the World Bank. I believe Morgan is also an affiliate here at CSIS with the Energy and National Security Program, and has done some really amazing thinking over the years, from fiscal policy to systems analysis, infrastructure investment, market regulation, you name it in the energy space, Morgan Bazilian has been there thinking about it. So could you I think it's sort of a blessing and a curse to go last on a panel, right? Because you have the opportunity to comment on, but maybe not overlap with some of what other folks have been saying. So could you comment on how you've been thinking about this, and maybe specifically focus in on how any advice to MDBs or the US government or other sort of players in this space?
Sure, thanks very much. And thanks to Sarah and CSIS for having me, and congratulations to you both on the paper. I think I'm just going to give a few personal reflections on it at the end. You know, about a decade ago, I was sitting in the United Nations with Bob Eichhorn, who's sitting in the back row there, who's then at the State Department, and it was right about the time where the curve that Sarah showed started to go in the direction that it has now clearly gone. It wasn't quite as clear then, but the direction of travel was clear. And we were sitting in the UN in Vienna thinking about how do we get this on the radar of the world's development community, let alone the energy sector. And back then that wasn't very clear how we would do that. And one thing that emerged from that was the Sustainable Energy for All initiative, other initiatives, and then the SDG 7, the Sustainable Development Goal 7 that came later. And then in between there, the US government's Power Africa initiative. And then events like this and reports like this and reports like the IEA's World Outlook on Energy Access, or whatever the title is. You know, so for me it's very exciting to see that travel is gone in the right direction. In other words, we're sitting here in an august institution in DC and discussing these issues. And then I would tie it to the fact that there's a lot of shared vocabulary around the issues, and all of the other speakers have used that shared vocabulary, whether it's leveraging the power of the private sector, or how we look at urbanization and energy, or how we look at economic development and energy. Even 10 years ago, that wasn't a foregone conclusion, right, when we were sitting there. And so I think that's terrific. And now the shared language is about an energy transition, right? If you come to any one of Sarah's terrific events in this building or this room, they can be put in a context of an energy transition. Well, you had CCS today already, right? Okay, CCS, whatever it is, nuclear, gas, anything. It's part of this energy transition. And that energy transition, as we commonly talk about it, at least here in the United States and in DC, has contours of moving towards a clean energy economy. It has something to do with clean energy and climate change, and that's the sort of direction, that's how you define what this energy transition we talk about. And what I find so interesting these days is that now that development story, the non-OECD curve, you have to attach that to the energy transition story. And if you don't, you're missing the whole picture, or the bulk of the picture, because the other curve is flat. So now that so not only has that energy and development story come through the ambassadors in New York and through the USAID and the World Bank and the IFC, but it's actually attached itself right integrally to the energy transition story. And so maybe I'll just say a couple things about that. So the other shared language pieces that I think other people have used the vocabulary up here, but I would just emphasize a couple of them. One is the term resilience, and now we see that everywhere, right? That's in the newspaper all the time. Energy systems have to be resilient, and why do they have to be resilient? Well, they have to survive hurricanes, and they also have to survive in rural places far from a grid, and they have to service refugee communities, et cetera, et cetera. Resilience is an important aspect, and just so I'm just going to give you a couple touch points where you can that this work might take up as it goes along, and that you can look up if you're interested. But so that piece of resilience is one, and that has links to the kind of technologies we're using, right? And the kind of technologies we're using, whether they're called off-grid, which means, you know, in someone's house, or mini-grid, which means sort of in between, or on the grid, which like this facility. What we see at the bank is that almost every country we're working in is interested, as Sarah said, not in the false dichotomy that it's one or the other, but in all three, and how they put that into their planning paradigms, right? And how do you put that into a planning paradigm? So traditionally in a power planning algorithm, it's a bunch of mathematical formulas that optimize something. The math is agnostic, of course, as math always is. And so the math will show you this least cost position as X, Y, or Z. So what we have now is new tools that take the new costs and the new realities of things like solar off-grid and mini-grids and hybrid mini-grids and on-grid with different kind of technologies and different efficiencies, and you plug it into this agnostic thing, but it gives you a very different answer than you used to get. What it gives you now is a mix of those three things, right? It doesn't. It will never say all of one or none, except for maybe in a place like Singapore, where it would say, you know, do all on-grid. But in any case, the tools exist, and they're modern and they're updated so that they are allowing us, and more importantly, the countries, to look at this in a useful light. And the other thing they're seeing, these same countries, after they go through that planning, is that if they're going along this energy transition and recognizing the cost declines and technologies like wind and solar, how do we integrate this into our system? So that's another big buzzword, right? Integration. And you have an enormous amount of work going on all over the world in integration. And the other one, I guess you see, is these links to, or another one, is the links to other sectors, which we haven't talked so much about today, which is the links to things like water security and food security. That energy, water, food thing the Germans named 10 years ago as a nexus, energy, water, food nexus. Now it's been, if you look closely, and there was a paper out in Nature Energy, I want to say, one of them recently, like in the last 2 weeks, where they took SDG 7, or the energy field, and looked at both the linkages to the other SDGs, which cover everything from industrial policy to water to gender. So they looked at the linkages, but they also looked at the possible tensions. Right, so there's a lovely graphic they have that I'm doing this with my hands to describe poorly, but the one that shows the linkages, which are strong, and then the tensions, which exist but are not as numerous. And I point you to that because I think it's really fascinating to see how strong those linkages. So it has linkages to all 17? Yeah. Of them. So I think that's a really important thing to say. And I'll close by saying my colleague in the World Bank Group mentioned some of the great work the IFC and the bank are doing on programs like Scaling Solar, which is a PPP, fundamentally a PPP sort of thing. There's been others in Africa. There was the offshore Sankofa gas project, which also used MIGA risk instruments, and then have to go to things like governance and regulatory and fiscal prudence and things like that once you have these new revenue streams. The bank also puts out annually now the Global Tracking Framework, which you've referenced here, which looks at the different metrics of this energy and development context. It also puts out something called RISE, which the acronym, I always forget what it is. It's about investment, enabling environment and investment. And so it goes through the whole policy and regulatory landscapes for, I think, 110 countries now, so that clients of the IFC or the IFC can look at that. And then jointly, the bank and the IFC put out this Doing Business report that came out, I guess, about a month ago. And the energy, and especially the electricity sections of Doing Business, are very sophisticated now. Where they used to be a little more generalized, now they have really fairly sophisticated indices there. And then lastly, there's also, of course, there's all the projects that the World Bank Group does and investments and all this, but there is also quite a rich amount of what are called internally and externally, I guess, is facilities. So when the bank has a trust fund, which means that donor countries give money for things that are more along the lines of policy or enabling environments. And we have now, through one of the trust funds called ESMAP, there's a facility for mini grids, there's a facility for grid integration, there's a facility for pricing, tariffs, subsidies, and there's a facility for mapping, renewable energy resource mapping. And those exist as facilities for countries to raise their hand and say, look, we need help on area X, Y, and Z. And they're not of the scale of a typical project. They're not hundreds of millions of dollars. These are, informing due diligence, this kind of thing. So a lot of that kind of, it's in some ways those are not as sexy as products to put out, but they're fundamentally more difficult to put out in the private sector, and that's where the public sector is playing an important role. Bless you. And I think I'll stop there, and thank you again for having me.
Yeah. This has been a really rich conversation, and I have a ton more questions, but I think I also see several very accomplished energy experts and development experts in the audience. So I think I'm going to turn it over to questions now. So are there any questions in the audience? Yes, this gentleman in the front. And please stand.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. To what extent are you able to use the internet to get some of this stuff together, to get the funders in there and get transparency and get inputs from the local people so people can see what's happening in their project? And have meetings online, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Should we take a few, or shall we?
Let's go one by one, I think. So, Morgan, if you had
Sure.
some thoughts.
I'm happy to. Which Morgan? It's Morgan.
Morgan Landy. ML.
Thanks for the question. So in terms of using technology to have more information flow, what we're seeing in our business is, because we're a taxpayer-funded organization, our own transparency is quite important for our shareholders and our board. So we have quite an open book in terms of what we're doing. We put it on our own website for 30 to 60 days before we ask our board of directors to approve any investment. So everything we do, we would do our due diligence, do our homework, negotiate our relationship with our client, and then before we go to our board for an approval, we would post a summary, especially on the environment, social, governance aspects, on our website for 30 days or 60 days, depending on the kind of project, as well as locally at the project level, to make sure that people have a chance to have an opinion before we present it to our board for an approval or a conversation. This is really important for us, to basically give stakeholders, whether they're sitting in Washington or sitting in the country we're investing in, a chance to have an opinion, to have enough information to have a reasonable question or answer or voice a concern. For us, that's really important. What we're seeing now is that's actually moving much more into the mainstream. We do it because we're a public organization and we have quite high transparency guidelines. What we're seeing now is in the private markets, there's increasing need and demand for transparency as well from a huge range of actors, from neighbors of power plants to civil society sitting in the capital city, to regulators who are regulating either the banking sector or the environment sector or the energy sector, to media, to academics, to investors sitting in Wall Street who are thinking about that particular country. There's a huge demand for information, and I think there's actually, in some ways, an overabundance of information. What's missing is good information and carefully thought through information so that interested parties can actually find out material information. So what we see happening now, and some things we're working on, is trying to develop toolkits to help our clients figure out if they want to be a good corporate citizen and if they want to be ahead of the curve and transparent, what kind of information should they be disseminating and to whom? Because right now, to be honest, one of the main challenges I think is there's too much information out there. People get lost with sustainability reports that really don't say anything. It's more marketing than real information. But increasingly, I think we're going to see more and more push for information. And companies, in my view, at least in my world, the private sector, companies are going to be, it's in their own interest to get ahead of that curve and be more transparent as opposed to hiding information. I think that's the way the world's going, and we're trying to help our clients do that. But it's an interesting time right now because there's no one answer. There's 1,000 different metrics. You could, there's Global Reporting Initiative, there's a UN Compact, there's IFC's own standards, there's World Bank standards, there's OECD standards. There's lots of standards out there. But guidance to companies on what's useful for them is still a bit unclear.
Sifting through the noise, both good
Yes.
and bad noise,
Yes.
is not an easy task. So Morgan Bazillion?
Yeah, just one other thing on, so that's the corporate side, and on the side of the topic here on the energy and development side, there's a new website the bank has, and you'll be able to Google it, I'll get it wrong, it's something like energyinfo. Something new, data, something. It's an open source repository for energy information, whether it's statistics or geospatial. There's a lot of geospatial information on there, and there's also now, along with the United Nations, there's an open source energy model that's available. This is on the UN DESA's website. An open source energy model available from a fairly simple perspective. You can run a couple different scenarios for almost any country in the world, and then we're taking on the bank side any of the public geospatial and similar type of data. And now it's live and available. So there is,
Lots of resources
that's
out
a
there.
tremendous resource. Yeah.
Excellent. There was a hand in the back, the woman in the red here.
Hi, my name is Karen St. John, retired from BP. I worked a lot with IFC and World Bank on the Caspian projects on BTC and ACG and Shah Deniz. I'd be interested in both Morgan's perspectives in terms of the role of natural gas within your investment portfolio at this point.
Excellent. Role of natural gas. Let's start with Morgan Bazillion this time, and then go to Morgan.
Yeah, I can give you a couple of reflections, right? I can't give an official World Bank view on that. I did mention something though that there, sort of in passing as I was finishing, that in a transition from Morgan's comments on public-private partnerships and risk in between the group, that this Sankofa gas project was seen as a very successful group working there. We also have projects like that are largely, from our perspective, largely guarantee projects, right? So that's something along the order of $900 million of internal bank guarantees along that catalyze something on the order of $9 billion in private sector, with all kinds of the leading private sector oil and gas majors. We also have something called the Global Gas Flaring Partnership, which you're aware of, but the others might not be aware of, that works with all kinds of companies and countries in working towards minimizing gas flaring from associated gas, and it also works on how the planning, that becomes a planning issue largely, how the planning can come in place to find a space for that gas. And then we have quite a few projects around what I call a regulatory wrap in the oil and gas sector, where countries are trying to come to grips with their natural resource endowments and how they are governed, and for everything from upstream through midstream and downstream, so regulation and policy. And that tends to be the largest part of the gas engagement, is through those regulatory and governance engagements.
So on the IFC side, what we're seeing is, again, as private investors are thinking about meeting particular objectives, let's say a government in Central America puts out a request for proposals for 300 megawatts of power and lets the investors decide how they want to meet that need, what's the lowest cost way of meeting that, they'll look at hydropower or solar or wind or gas or coal or diesel. Increasingly, with gas prices being low and the ability to lock in gas prices for long terms, many companies are looking at natural gas as imported natural gas as a way to meet energy needs, even in countries that don't have local gas production. So that means LNG to power, that means all kinds of new innovations, which I think right now are becoming quite interesting economically. As gas prices are low and as we have increasing gas in the US that's being exported, as was said earlier, it's creating opportunities outside of the US for locking in low-cost gas to deliver local energy opportunities. So we're seeing right now a lot of activity in the gas space.
Can I
Of
add
course.
something as a former bank staff person, also worked with IFC, and obviously one thing that's helping gas in these organizations is the fact that it's not coal, right? So anything but coal, and so what happens is a big push towards a much greater willingness to do gas, because when you look at the power sector, you say, oh, I can't do coal, but I can do gas, let's do gas.
Yeah, a couple other hands. Yes, gentleman in the back.
Hi, Bob Eichort from the Atlantic Council. Thank you all for keeping the energy and development on the agenda, especially in the United States.
You too.
And I have a comment and a question. You mentioned the challenge of urbanization, which is clearly going to be in all regions. And the challenge, Philip, you were talking about in terms of income development, and especially in the rural areas. And so I would encourage, I think a lot more work needs to be done on this process of both increasing incomes through, Morgan, like we were talking in Vienna, about productive investments in agro-business and those kinds of areas, and what that means in terms of not only sort of rural communities, but peri-urban development and that kind of thing that can put some relief to the large cities that are sort of the magnets usually of the thing. So I think that and I was interested to see that the new IEA report does talk about the broader agricultural and rural development. You know, I mean, I started in Aden when we did rural development. And obviously energy was looked at very much as a productive input in those days, and not so much as just connecting households with electricity. And I think that there needs to be a stronger emphasis on that in terms of entrepreneurship and agribusiness development. My question sort of is framed from both Morgans, Morgan L and Morgan B. You talked about de-risking investment. And obviously there's been a lot of work done recently on de-risking investment, whether it's loan guarantees or aggregation funds or what have you. And Morgan B, you talked about enabling environment, creating that regulatory and institutional framework that's going to attract the investment. My concern is the following. One, that you can deal with some of the short-term obstacles to investment. But the broader question of the political and governance transition and what it is going to take to help countries develop better institutions so that these projects can be sustainable and that there will be more investment that will be able to follow from them. So my question is, how do you see that? And I think that the funds that are going into this are really inadequate, especially if USAID starts reducing its programs in Power Africa and places like that. I mean, you have these facilities in SMAP and other things, but what do you see is needed on that side from your standpoint?
I'm happy to just go down the line.
Thanks, Bob. Easy question. You know, the one piece I have written down here that I didn't go into was governance, of course, and it's the big development question. You know, I can't answer your question any better than you can, of course, and probably less. But I would say that to add to that, or add to the complexity and difficulty, what we see in the bank is that the IDA, or the Fund for the the poorest countries is increasing in scale and importance, and a number of those countries are then on this list, this FCV list, fragile and conflict state list, right? And how do we invest in these countries successfully? So we're not talking anymore about South Africa or Argentina or the names that have been brought up, or China and India. We're talking about South Sudan and Somalia and other places. How do we even get to the question you're asking in these countries for those investments? I don't have a great answer to that. One thing I'm really interested in looking more at is, can we use some of these more boring techie subjects like energy to make incremental inroads to build trust in conflict states, especially in conflict states or in fragile and conflict states, without solving the whole big problem first? In other words, can we get in there with some projects that will help elements of democracy, help elements of trust, help elements of technical know-how, regulatory know-how as a building block? So that's, I'm taking a simple out on the question, but it's a key one, obviously.
Thanks. So from my perspective, I'll talk about how to make the private investment sustainable, if you will. And 6 or 7 years ago, I was living in Turkey, working on energy in that part of the world. And just as the Turkish government was working on reforming its energy sector to allow the private sector to come in, and the bank was heavily involved on the regulatory side, helping the government think about wholesale market, pricing metrics, how do you regulate with the right incentives. And then IFC was working with companies that were actually very nervous that this was an untested system. And would you actually invest in a private power distribution grid, not knowing if the regulatory tariff view was going to actually be fair or not 4 years from now? So they wanted someone like IFC to be there with them as a risk mitigation mechanism. But at the end of the day, every investor will make a decision on institutions and long-term trust. Do they trust that this is a trend that will continue in that country? Will the government continue to set prices based on a spot market or not? Will the regulator do what is in the regulations or not? And in our experience, money's flowing to countries where investors have trust, whether it's because they just believe that country, they believe the government, or because they can somehow add on risk mitigation instruments like the World Bank offers to help have it be a security blanket, if you will. The longer term solution really is, institutions and predictability. But as we all know, many countries don't have that. And the less you have that, the less likely it is you'll be able to attract really the kind of money you need, at least with the private sector.
Philip, anything to add?
Well, really two observations. One is when you look in particular at the access agenda, the fact of the matter is most of the really big successful access expansion programs have been run, I hate to say this, Morgan, by state-owned enterprises. So you look at what's happened in China, you look even in Brazil with their Luz para Todos program, Lights for Everything, where they relied on Electrobras. You look at what happened in North Africa. So private sector is relevant, but sometimes when it comes to that basic provision of electricity services, the public sector is often critical, in part because, especially when you go into extremely poor areas, the fact of the matter is, and this touches upon an issue you're raising, it's actually not easy to provide electricity in such a manner that you actually end up necessarily with strong economic development. Because if you bring electricity into extremely poor areas where there's not other economic activity happening, electricity in and of itself is not a panacea. So that also points, I think, to a second issue. In a more positive light, what we are seeing, somebody noted the figures for Latin America. For me, it's striking. There are only 21 million people is a lot, but relatively speaking, there are only now 21 million people without access to electricity in Latin America. It was a much greater amount before. And so in some ways, part of the answer is, beside these sort of extremely fragile states, South Sudan and the like, is to promote overall economic development. And as you promote overall economic development, what you see is when you provide access, the conditions for productive uses exist through a variety of other things that are present. And I think the last comment I just want to make, because obviously we tend to focus a lot, whether explicitly or implicitly, in sub-Saharan Africa, is that across sub-Saharan Africa, you're seeing a lot of economic development in a lot of countries that are really improving the ability not only to provide access but productive uses. You've been referring to the Ghana project, but aside from this massive gas field in Ghana, the fact of the matter is we've seen a lot of economic development in Ghana, in Tanzania, in Kenya, in Uganda, that is helping to provide some of the conditions that you're saying need to exist. Where we're not seeing it is obviously in more of the failed states context.
Sarah?
First, Bob, to all the work that you're doing in this space, which is hugely helpful to this conversation. Thank you. On the governance issue in particular, maybe one anecdote and one thing to point to. We did do an event here the other day on Power Africa, the future of Power Africa, and it got much into these issues, right? Which is important. The idea that once you get a number of projects and a system for moving projects, there's a path and a plane beyond that, which is how do you create ongoing enabling environments. And so very much something that a very successful program is grappling with. How do they sort of build on that success and learn to incorporate those things? So I think it's a very timely issue. One of the things that routinely came up in some of the country-specific work that we did over the course of the project is actually something I think you talked about, Morgan, but maybe in a slightly different way, which is actually some of the new technology ventures, particularly the off-grid technology ventures in some of these countries, is creating the impetus for some governance reform that didn't exist before because there's competition. So if you didn't want to change the regulatory environment in X, Y, or Z country because you didn't have to, you kind of do now. You feel like there's enough alternatives out there that you may be losing out by not capturing those customers. And so that competitive dynamic is productive. How far that will go, I'm pretty sure we're going to have to wait and see. But I think that was one of the most optimistic things I found in doing all of this work, was that people find that technological competition, business case innovation is really what's driving governments that have been stuck in the same sort of regulatory or financing rut for a long time, feeling like they've got to change what they're doing. And so I think that's really promising.
Thanks for the question, Bob. And it's just the only thing I'll add is, and the reason I think it was good that we spent a little extra time on that particular question is it was a driving force behind the collaboration between our two projects here, the energy program and the development shop here at CSIS. So definitely hit the nail on the head, and this is going to be part of a longer ongoing discussion. I'm cognizant of time, so I want to take 3 questions. The gentleman in the glasses on the aisle, and then the gentleman in the back right, and then the gentleman in the aisle in the back. We'll go in that order.
Thank you. John Hyman, Odlano, off-grid cold chain. I also used to work for Aldrich International, which is an Africa-focused IPP in London. I guess my question is a sort of 2-part question. One is, what are the sources of private capital that's waiting to flow into some of these projects? And related to that is it a question of just de-risking and making more projects just off the shelf, pre-packaged, here you go, it's all done for you. And also, while it's relatively straightforward to sort of package sort of a major, like a pipeline or a power station, what about the sort of more esoteric, smaller projects, the sort of off-grid, microgrid type projects, which are more interesting, a bit more fiddly, as it were?
Okay, good 2-part question. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Sastila Kasiri from Oxfam. Good to see old colleagues on the panel there again. But thanks for the event. 2 real quick questions. The Scaling Solar project in Zambia, that's been a great success story and has been in the work for a number of years. I wonder if you could say more about why Zambia in particular was a good model and where you see the next fronts are. I mean, 5 cents a kilowatt hour is unheard of, and that's fantastic. And then a broader question, I'm always struck when I see the air pollution sort of statistics, right? And I can't help but think, in the news, Delhi, a city I used to call home, and is now at 1,000 parts per million, twice the health regulations for pollution. And in all of the perches that you sit in, how much of that do you think is factoring into decision makers' processes when we think about urbanization, when we think about transport? It's starting to become less of an abstraction now and more of a monetized sort of commodity. So useful to get your thoughts. Thanks.
Good questions.
Yeah, Bill Eichord, and in contrast to my brother, I spent 30 years in the oil and gas and utility sector, so I have a private sector question. I'm glad, Philippe, you raised the issue of the SOEs and the role of the SOEs, because my observation would be that one of the things that is holding back investment right now from the private sector is the role of the SOEs in several significant economies. And I think there's a disconnect of what you've said, and I'd be interested in sort of what your joint observations would be, and I'll be interested to read the paper. But I think there's a disconnect between the flow of investment and the direction that it's going with SOEs, not only in terms of SOEs in their own country, but SOE investment outside of their countries, which is increased significantly. I don't have the data with me, but it's increased significantly recently. And I think that's going to come, the chickens are going to come home to roost on that in the next few years, and those trends of how you meet demand are going to be affected by the role the SOEs are playing.
It's impossible to have this conversation without talking about SOEs, so it's a very good question. We have a question on where private capital comes from, and with a focus on micro and off-grid. We have a why Zambia question that led to a broader question, and then there's the SOE question. So I'm just going to go down the line, maybe starting with Sarah this time, and just pick any or all of those.
There's a lot of them. I think it's really funny. We've got 2 Morgans and we've got 2 Eichords, so that's definitely got to be a first. So maybe I'll touch on because you're going to do the SOE one, so maybe I'll touch on the air pollution one very quickly, because I think it's a good one. You know what's funny/tragic about it is there's 2 views that we hear throughout the course of this project, and one is on the really easy, the kinds of things that planners and investors can do to incorporate, solutions to local air pollution problems, right? And so I think there is an increasing awareness. There's a big drive on making sure people understand what those solutions are, what the paybacks for them are, and how to sort of institutionalize them. And so I think that there will be, my sense is, a lot more focus on this in a number of places around the world. I am not sure that fully gets incorporated into our views of the limits of urbanization. And the reason for that is I think air pollution is just one of the limitations of urbanization. There are many more. And yet it doesn't seem to be one of those, whenever you talk to the people who are doing trends on urbanization, it doesn't seem to be one of the things where there is yet a recognition that there may be natural limitations to how quickly those trends can evolve. And so the sort of sad part of that is I think when you look historically at places that have dealt with local air pollution issues and urbanization issues, it's only once they've reached a certain level of development, because the trade-offs for economic growth and the health impacts, they just don't, until you can afford to do something about them and it's broadly recognized and people feel like they can afford it, right? I think that there's just an acceptance of that level of pollution. And so I hope that changes. I hope that's a little bit different, but that is something we heard reflected in some of the conversations we had on that particular topic.
Okay, so I'm going to start with the air pollution issue. Having had the Energy Environment Division at the IEA, where we looked at climate change, and we started pushing much more on the air pollution issue. And why did we start? One of the reasons we started to push a lot more on the air pollution issue is because people are much more motivated by air pollution than they are about climate change. And while some people may focus on the co-benefits of climate change from an air pollution perspective, what we felt the reality is China has a war on pollution. China doesn't have a war China has a war, yes, on pollution, not a war on climate change. So I think what we are seeing that is heartening is an increased recognition of the need to deal with the issue of air pollution. Now, I can't say, unfortunately, whether that is exceeding the rate at which air pollution, air quality is deteriorating, but clearly we're seeing an increased acknowledgement of the need to deal with that issue. In fact, there's an article in today's Washington Post that talks about how the Chinese are stepping up to the point of being willing to sacrifice economic growth for that. We'll see where India goes, and the like, but air pollution is very tangible. It's something people understand. Climate change is intangible and far off into the future. And so if you didn't put it in this context, but if I would put the two next to each other, I think there's a much greater ability to deal with the air pollution issue, and there are a lot of positive co-benefits in terms of climate change. Interestingly enough, and I can't say why because I don't work at the IEA, but the IEA used to have as a climate scenario, I'll call it, was a 450 parts per million scenario. They've moved away from that in the recent WEO, and they have a sustainability scenario. It doesn't have climate in there. It seems to be largely climate, as far as I can tell, but they've rolled into that air pollution and access. I think actually the air pollution and access probably don't change the line very much from where it was from a climate perspective, but it's an interesting recognition of the fact that for an organization like the IEA, which had the United States and China and India, air pollution clearly is becoming an increasingly important point. And let me just say, when we're talking about urbanization, and like a lot of big problems we have around air pollution has to do with agriculture, the interface of urban areas and agriculture, and I think that was one of the issues that was facing Delhi. It's one of the issues that happens in Paris. It's not only what happens in Paris, but there are certain agricultural practices outside. Excellent point on SOEs. I think there is to some extent a tension between the SOEs and the private sector. I'll point to an issue raised about SOE behavior outside of their country. Let me just say, when I was at the World Bank, what we said was SOEs outside of their country, we view them like the private sector as well. And that's not totally true, but it kind of gives you a sense of how we try to grapple with that issue. EDF, investing outside of France and sub-Saharan Africa, we viewed it as the private sector. But I think clearly there is a tension. There is money that's going to compete. There's China Incorporated that clearly is doing things in China and outside of China, and the fact that their SOEs clearly has an impact on their investment behavior. I'm going to say this, I always smile a little when I sit next to my former IFC colleagues and they talk about the private sector. Yeah, that's great, but that reflects a certain model. And what we've seen in China, for example, is a massive investment and expansion that was driven by inefficient SOEs. When I hear what's coming out of China these days, I don't get the sense that they're moving ahead with their continued liberalization agenda. They seem to be moving back to an SOE-dominated approach. So I think one of the realities as we look forward is inefficient SOEs are going to be a part of the energy and development landscape. What are the implications of that? What are the implications in terms of environmental issues? What are the implications in terms of climate change? What are the implications in terms of investment patterns?
Morgan?
So a few observations, just picking up on the SOE question. I mean, from the IFC side, we really work with the private sector, but we do have a subnational financing window, which covers the gap between what the World Bank has, which is sovereign lending with always a sovereign guarantee, and IFC, which is private lending, which is not able to accept sovereign guarantee. So it's against our articles of agreement. We cannot accept the government repayment obligations. We're supposed to be taking commercial risk. But what that left out was municipal entities or state-owned enterprises that don't have sovereign guarantees. And that's kind of fell between the cracks, if you will, within the World Bank group. So we do have an ability to work on those kind of investments, but we always ask our question, could this be done in the private sector? What's the rationale to keep this as an SOE? And we have to convince ourselves and our board that there's a good economic reason that the public sector should do this where the private sector would not do it, usually based on economic and tariff and cost aspects. Rural roads, for example. The private sector is never going to invest in rural roads. But an airport, they would. So, we think an airport should be done mostly in the private sector, where rural roads, really, there's no private capital to go there. But it's an interest, there is this tension in the system, which is real, and I think it's just part of the dynamic. In terms of the sources of private capital, what we see now, we've been trying over the past 5 years or so, our typical co-financing at IFC is to bring in private commercial banks under an umbrella program of syndicated loans. About 5 years ago, we started doing the same, but with equity capital. So not lenders, not banks, but sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies, pension funds, who we basically act as a fund manager, and they co-invest alongside of us. So for us, for our clients, they get access to 2 or 3 times the amount of capital than we could do by our own balance sheet. So our clients are happy, they have bigger access to more money. For the sovereign wealth funds or pension funds, they're interested in financing in the developing world, but they don't have the skills or the people to actually do all the homework to see is it a good investment or not. So they rely on us to do that work. We do all the due diligence, we invest our own money, and they piggyback alongside of us. And for us, we charge a fee. So we think it's kind of a win-win, although it's still early days. It's been about 5 years. But right now we have $10 billion of money from sovereign wealth funds, pension funds investing alongside of IFC, where they basically outsource to us the due diligence. And they don't have to invest in everything we invest in, but they have the option to invest alongside of us if they want. We think it's an interesting model. More recently, we've done the same thing. I think the big pool of untapped capital for energy investment and infrastructure in the developing world is insurance company money. Because insurance company, as we all know, has very long-term horizons. They invest in 10, 20, 30-year assets. And they do it mostly, usually you need to have an investment grade rating to get an insurance company from the US, for example, to invest. Most of our countries are not investment grade. We're sub-investment grade. So how do you square that circle without just going only to the most developed countries, the Mexicos of the world, for example? So we've developed something called we call it MCPP, I forget what it stands for, which is just closed this year with $1 billion of insurance money from 2 insurance companies that are taking the same model we have on the equity side and putting it on the infrastructure side. They will co-invest alongside of us in our pool of infrastructure assets. It's a risk for them because they're trusting us to do the good homework. It's a risk for us. So hopefully we make good decisions. But I think there is money out there looking to invest. The question is, how do you intermediate that? In our view, it's about de-risking. The last point I'll make is on the off-grid, microgrid. Actually, it's something really interesting happening now. It's very different than the traditional energy business team. And a different kind of risk profile, different kind of skill set. It's much more like venture capital. So at IFC, we have a separate team of people that do venture capital in new energy technologies that has a very different risk-reward outlook on life. They're much happier to take large risks or small amounts of money, but much higher risk. And we decided to put it in a different team because they really have a different kind of mentality in that world. Happy to talk about it more offline. Thanks.
Thanks. Last word to Morgan Bazilian.
I guess just a little comments on a couple of these somewhat eclectic pieces. The SOE discussion tends to have a flavor of, the state-owned enterprises in the energy sector are bad and we should move towards some level of liberalization along the lines of some other model we have, whether it's a US, European, or some other model. And that's difficult because it's not a homogeneous conversation, as you well know, and power is very different from oil and gas, of course. So on the power side, we just did a full review of, I believe, every country in sub-Saharan Africa's power regulation, tariff setting, the whole deal, and it's out there and publicly available. And that came up with from everything from cost of service to tariffs, and then combined with that, a look at 6 countries in the IPPs, the independent power producers, and how they're functioning or not functioning in those different markets. So that's on the power side. Look, on the oil and gas side, you know better than we do, I think, and there's other people from the oil majors here who do too, but it's a much more mixed bag, right? And whether you think Anadarko should be in Mozambique or whoever is now in Vaca Muerta and the changing situations there, I think oil and gas majors are much more comfortable in some of these situations than an IPP can be within a regulatory framework that's not liberalized. Without getting into the whole discussion of did liberalization here work the way it was envisioned and priced, et cetera. I mean, there's no one in the room who could explain the entirety of the regulatory framework in the United States power sector as an example. I guarantee it. This topic of the off-grid and the microgrid is very hot right now. It's especially hot, as you know, in East Africa, right? So it's an East Africa story, largely. There's an Indian story to it too, but the story you hear in the press anyway is an East Africa story, as you well know. There's private sector money from Silicon Valley going into these companies, which makes it even cooler. And what Sarah said, I think I agree with mostly, which is it's one of those cases where the private sector is ahead of the regulation has to catch up, right? But the private companies would say, well, we don't want your regulation, right? We're only in existence because of a lack of regulation, because of an oversight, because we're ahead of the curve. The only thing I would point to there is that there's a terrific set of quarterly reports that Bloomberg New Energy Finance is putting out now called Frontier Energy or Frontier Power or something like that. It's a quarterly report. The bank and the IFC has done one with them on that market that includes some of this VC stuff, but they're continuing in a quarterly, and it shows every transaction going on. Of course, a lot of them are in Kenya and East Africa. But I would also point to some of those modeling tools and geospatial data, because what's happening a lot in that space, as you know, is this geospatial data we have on demographics and other things is really influencing where some of these people are putting their markets based on demographics and infrastructure, or lack of. And then the last thing, Scaling Solar, you mentioned. You obviously know a lot about Scaling Solar. Scaling Solar has a terrific website, actually. Yes, it started in Zambia first. As you know, there was a big power crisis in Zambia. I mean, there's sort of always a power crisis, but there's a more acute power crisis to do with the hydro resource in Zambia, as you know. I think that helped spur it. There was also quite a lot of work done by the government with the bank and the IFC on, as I called it, the more boring stuff, the resource mapping, the locations of the plants, things like that, how they relate to the distribution feeders, et cetera, that was done sort of expeditiously. And I believe, although I'm not positive, that the other countries that originally were in mind were Uganda, at least, and then I cannot remember the other one. But the website's terrific. They've put online a lot of the model contracts and how to price and all those kind of things. So yeah, I think it's a really exciting opportunity for those countries, and it seems to be working. They got great bidders, right? Or what look like great bidders. Hopefully the prices are sustainable. I mean, in those sectors, I think the crux is not necessarily anymore on what those contracts and legal documents look like, or whether it's going to go back to the old situation that happened in Europe, where people were underbidding in reverse auctions, right? That's why Europe went to tariffs, if you'll recall, and renewables. So now we're seeing, as I imagine some of you have seen, or all of you have seen, the last round of bidding in Mexico. The regulator in Mexico actually used to sit 2 offices down from me. He's now in Mexico City, and he's a magnificent regulator and very smart guy. Their prices are at 2 cents, below 2 cents as of last week for utility scale PV. So, you know, let's hope that works. It'd be great. If that's the real price, then all of this changes, right?
Your comment on the U.S. American infrastructure and trying to understand it is giving me a little bit of a headache trying to think about all this. So on behalf of CSIS and our 2 programs, thank you for coming. Thank you for your very thoughtful questions, and please join me in thanking the panelists.